Square. I'm here in the square of Wadsworth, and we're going to try and give you a little history of Wadsworth back in the early 30s and middle 30s, where I was born and raised. So why don't you come along with me and we'll take a walk around our town. Now, next door in this parking lot now that belongs to the bank, there's a big, beautiful home here, and it was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Straight. Beautiful porch on it, and gingerbread, and it's the type of house that nowadays some of the younger folks in the new allotments are building replicas of. But it was a beauty, and it sat here for years. Next to the big Straighten home was a yellow home here that had belonged to the offices for Dr. Worsler, who was a dentist here in town, and he was right next to the Straighten home. And then going up the street further, we ended up with some spaces in there that possibly were driveways to get to the back, some of these buildings, and of course the backyards for the two homes here. And on the corner up here, which was the corner at that time, was a dual building there that was the Big W Meat Market. And it was a great meat market for Wadsworth. And the next building just prior to it on the corner was the Wadsworth Cab. That's the first I remember, was a Wadsworth taxi cab. We had a taxi cab here, and it was owned at that time by John Hines, or Chuck Hines. And then there was a deluxe cab also in town, but I don't know which of the two were first. But I drove for him for a short time when I was called back into the service and for the Korean War, and our commanding general passed away the day we were called. They sent me back home for 30 days, and I helped Chuck drive cab around town during some of the big snowstorms of the early 50s. When I first remember, the old Masonic Temple, which originally was a Masonic temple, was the City Hall. A Mayor Durr was there as mayor of the town of Wadsworth, and then they built the new City Hall here, where now is a parking lot. It was torn down just a few years ago for the new City Hall, and at that time, of course, they had 3 policemen in Wadsworth: Tommy Lucas, Ed Transu, and Harold Weldy. That was the end of the police department. Tommy Lucas was the original, went from constable to police chief and became a police chief until his retirement, and then became mayor of the town of Wadsworth. Now up here where the automatic car washer, just before you get to Fixers Agency, one time was a Shell gas station, and when I first remembered, it was owned by the 2 brothers from Wadsworth, Ben Young and his brother. And right behind it, either one side or the other, was a small little building, and later on was a florist shop. The Lutheran church, when I remember, had 2 large trees in the front yard, and the trees were as high as the spires on the church. When I first remember this building, it was the City Hall. Mr. Durr was the mayor at that time. Of course, there were prior mayors. And prior to that, it was a Masonic temple originally, I understand. Later on, it became a recreation hall for residents of Wadsworth, and it had basketball court. We held boxing matches in here. You built model airplanes, and you could fly them around inside the building. And then it became later on, of course, senior citizens home, which is, I believe, what it holds now, senior citizens recreation hall. Now, going down the street, the building which is now, of course, Holmes Brook Ace Hardware and Chippewa Lake Valley Bank, and it used to be a drugstore at one time. This at one time was the Park Tavern Hotel. The Park Tavern Hotel was a beautiful old building, and it many times had rooms for some of the presidents of the United States, for some of the nationally known and world-known persons that stopped and stayed there. And with it was a Dr. Kreider. In the back was the veterinarian here in town, was a Dr. Kreider, and he was in there. It was a big, beautiful, and it held all this space where this building now exists. Going down the street a little further, the first business in there was a Robert Sandos. Mr. Bob Sandos had a cafe in there, and it was an A1 cafe. It had some billiard tables in there, but he had the classiest place in town as far as a cafe, and it was there for years and years. This was Hoagland Hardware, and it had been Hoagland Hardware as long as I could remember. Mr. Hoagland was quite a gentleman, and his son took it over, and it was a family hardware. Mrs. Hoagland worked here, and the son here. The second story, which housed a 4-lane bowling alley. I first remember 4-lane bowling alley with a small billiard room beside it, and of course upstairs you could see the people coming in and out with the stage equipment for the footlighters. They later on stored their equipment and all their stage scenes and that upstairs here. And of course also upstairs was a Dr. Goss, who was a dentist here. He was one of the first I remember in this area in the offices upstairs. It was Dr. Goss. Next to it here, starting on the corner, was Wright's Department Store. A Mr. and Mrs. Diamond owned the Wright's Department Store, and they held it for years and years. It was the only department store I could remember outside of Wolf's on College Street. And later on, the Diamonds sold out, and it became a variety of different stores in the later years. And that was right here to the corner of High Street and College Street. Now, around the corner on College Street, there was an opening for a downstairs here. The opening from west coming east, and the first barber I remember was a fellow by the name of George Aker, and I believe he had a wooden leg. And George had the first barber shop there, and after George Aker came Mr. Mike Motzko, who was from town here, and Mike had his barber shop there for years underneath the Wright building here. I don't think many people knew that all the corners here, Wright's, Sisson Bank, and Nielsen Jeweler, all except Brenneman's, had a basement underneath, and they were all occupied by barber shops, all by barber shops at one time, with a steel railing around them, where the people here would sit on the railing and watch the people passing by and greeting them and visiting with them. All three of them had the steel railings, I remember, at one time, and that was quite a meeting place for a lot of people, just to stop and visit around town and sit on that railing. Underneath the Wright building, there was an outside elevator, and the elevator would take in the supplies and the storage area under the building. And that still exists here. That still is here. Going west on College Street, on the north side of the street, was a small tailor shop. Originally, I remember as Weinsheimer. Mr. Weinsheimer had the tailor shop in there. Later on, it became Western Union and Railway Express. I at one time worked for Western Union, delivering telegrams, and most of the deliveries, as I said earlier, were down the Injector Hill to the mat shop of the Ohio Injector Company. Later on, I worked also for Railway Express when a fellow from town here that everyone remembers by the name of Ace Fisher drove the truck, and I used to help Ace pick up the deliveries from the train station down the south end of Wadsworth and deliver them around the business areas and around the city. Now it houses Time Warner Cable. Then comes an alleyway that's been here for years, which was the rear entrance for the stores along here, including Hoagland Hardware. The next business in here were different little buildings. Earlier, it was a PTA shop, used clothing, and other stores were in this building here. Now, next to that was a building that was originally, I remember it as Joe Bender's restaurant. Joe Bender was a famous name around Wadsworth, always was. And he had a little restaurant in here, and he would allow at one time some of the transit traffic from the railroad down the south end that were riding, of course, free. He would allow them to stay down in the basement and sleep overnight, bring them up in the morning, feed them breakfast, and they'd be on their way to another town, another city, along the railroad tracks, hitching a ride. Now later it became Martin's Restaurant. Martin's Restaurant, and after that, of course, a different assortment of businesses went in and out of here. I believe at one time it was also business utilities. Above these storerooms were several stories, and these housed apartments. Different people rented apartments around the town here that wanted to live in town. And they went up and down the stairs. They were nice little efficiency apartments. Next to that, this space here, this parking space, was Don Merriman's, and Don Merriman had at one time record shop, different sales of different products here.
Bicycles, that was a big thing.
Bicycles were sold here, but in front here, he had his gas pumps. They were on the street, and at that time, that was before the state of Ohio, and the zoning did not allow gas station pumps to pump gasoline onto vehicles parked on the street. And he had been here for years, later became mayor of Wadsworth, and a great gentleman, him and his wife. It was a local store run by local people, local and private family, Don Merriman. Now here was Siffert's gas station, which was also a gas station with pumps on the street in front. And Mr. Siffert ran this for years before he moved up onto the corner of Broad Street and South Lyman Street. And he had apartments also upstairs, and in the back on the ground floor was storage for cars. You could park your car there, he would repair it, but also parking for people who lived in town who wanted to park their cars overnight. They rented garage spaces from Mr. Siffert. Next to that was a furniture store that had been here for years. When I first remember it was Finnerfrock Furniture. Mr. Finnerfrock also had a funeral home. One of the first ones he had was down the south end on the corner of Chestnut and South Main Street. And an earlier one was right down here at the bottom of Holmesbrook, where the Holmesbrook Supply is. The house next to it, just west of it, was his funeral home. He had his furniture store here, later on moved down to the south of Wadsworth here in, I believe, Canal Fulton, in that area. But when the ambulance was called here, Mr. Finnerfrock had a gentleman that worked for him selling furniture. You'd see him run out of here, run down the hill, just about where Holmesbrook Builder Supply is, get the ambulance and take off for the accident, along with Hilliards and Bixler's. Later on, it became Springer and Wadsworth Furniture, and of course the building is torn down now, raised, and in there now is a restaurant, and of course Knapp's Firestone Store. And that was prior to probably one of the oldest churches in Wadsworth. There's the corner of Pardee and College Street, still standing. Walking along here, we run into the corner of College and South Pardee. And by the way, on this bank here, last couple of years, I've noticed some wheel marks here, and I've never been able to find out what caused them. I'm going to have to ask some of the merchants in the area now that they can probably solve that quiz for me. Here's St. Mark's Episcopal Church. They tell me is one of the oldest churches still standing in Wadsworth there. And it still has the big Wadsworth Week or Blue Tip Festival Parade. They always have people sitting here on the banks watching the parade go by, and the different clubs sell hot dogs, ice cream social, hamburgers, and it's quite a meeting place for the Blue Tip Festival for quite a few of the people that want to watch it from the downtown area of Wadsworth. The parade stops here, the beginning of the parade, so they can light the match up there. And by the way, I've been in that parade as long as I can remember in the color guard. And in the front of the parade was Tony Millici, Harry Miller, myself, and Clarence Rook. We're the only original ones left there, still marching. I think this year was the first year that Harry Miller and Tony Millici finished there. Did not march this year. They finished it last year, that's right. But Clarence Rook and myself are still in the parade, and we stop here and have a wonderful time. That's a good parade, big parade. Behind him was a big, beautiful home, was the residence of Dr. Bernard and his office. And it had been there for years, and I believe the sons and possibly the grandsons have become optometrists in the city, and they're still here. And this building was the East Ohio Gas Company, and a Mr. Blau ran this office. He was in charge of the office. I believe his brother also worked with the East Ohio Gas Company, and the building still exists. In this corner, on the corner of College and South Pardee, stood a gas station, Fleet Wing gas station, owned by a Mr. Nicodemus. Mr. Nicodemus and his sons ran the service station. Later on, it became Wadsworth Oil, and it was owned by Mr. E. Vance Baldwin. Now, everybody in town knew him as Vance Baldwin, but he didn't use the first name, which was Evelyn.
That's an old English name.
It's an old English name.
It looked like Evelyn when you looked at it.
It looked like Evelyn when you looked at it. And knowing Mr. Baldwin, I'm sure he wouldn't use that. He wouldn't use that at all. But he was known as Vance Baldwin, and was here for years. A few more words about these service stations or gas stations. In my day, they were open on Sundays. You could come in here on Sunday and it'd take them maybe an hour, hour and a half to give you an oil change, because they really gave you the service. They would take the air cleaner off and wipe it out and visit with you, and it was a service station. Now next to that was a building here. The headstone still stands above it, and I believe it was the original building where W.S. Bixler Electric had its first storeroom. The sign on the front of the building is Sally's Shop, but above it is a stone that says W.S. Bixler, the electric company. Next to that was a small storeroom here, and at one time had held the business of All's Meat Market. All's Meat Market. And it was quite a meat market. They did quite a business, and at that time, without the superstores and the supermarkets, the meat markets, the small grocery stores, was something that was all over this country and all the towns and the cities, small grocery stores. And the next building is Stonier's Jewelry, and as far back as I could remember, it was Stonier's Jewelry. Now, I realize that Mr. and Mrs. Stonier are no longer here, but who the owners now are of Stonier's Jewelry, it still is Stonier's Jewelry. Now, here on the corner of College and Wacrusa was Wolf's Department Store. It was a department store. Downstairs it had toys, glasses, household, and above it still stands the block above the front door here. It says H. Wolf, 1924. And that H stood for Mr. Henry Wolf. And it was a family affair. Henry Wolf and his wife, and son Cleo Wolf and his wife, they ran this store for years and years. Cleo ended up there as a department store, later on Singer sewing machines. He did the repairs and the sale of Singer sewing machines in this same store here. Now, as you went downstairs in Wolf's department store, as a kid, I always wanted to go down there because that's where they had the toys for Christmas and the other times of the year. And I had no problem going down the steps. But if you were an adult, the overhead on the bottom of the stairs was low enough that you could hit your head and probably knock you right down on the steps. Now, I don't know anybody that's hurt that way, but you had to be careful. I believe they had a little sign over there, watch the overhead. And I believe a basement still exists here. Most department stores, I looked in the door, and it's still the same staircase that was down. Still exists. I see the railing around it, which is now Wadsworth Music. It turned out to be different businesses between Wolf's and Wadsworth Music. And it's a great part of town. Great part. It's a great town. Great town. I call it a town, not a city. We want to keep it as a town. It's a good town. Now here on Wacrusa, just south of the Wolf's department store, now is the Banner Printing Company off the square. That originally, Smith Dairy built that building, and it had a little counter in there for food and for dairy products and ice cream, sodas. And the building just south of that, near the court there, Wacrusa Court, was closest food locker. It was one of the first locker stores where you could take your food up there and put it in cold lockers. And across the street was the Wadsworth News Banner. Now on the other corner of Wacrusa and College Street was the Ford Garage that I early remember. The Ford Garage later on became the Star Theater, and later on became Knapp's Firestone, and now is Wadsworth Hardware, owned by Louis Graff. Up the street, the next building was a small building which housed Hemminger's Bakery. Hemminger Bakery has been here for years, had great jelly buns and cream sticks and all baked goods. Later on, Mr. Hemminger moved to Florida, and then it became, I believe, an assortment of stores, including Ott's Carpet Store and all different variety of stores. The next building here, originally that I remember, was a restaurant, and I believe it was Coppa's Restaurant. Later on it became Frolic's Restaurant, and later on it became the well-known Collector's Restaurant. And next to that were Sharky's Barber Shop, was Hood's Bicycle Shop. Mr. Hood had the bicycle shop. I believe his daughter was a teacher. Now next to that, two buildings were in here. One of them was the A&P, the original A&P that I can remember in Wadsworth, and the Kroger Grocery Company. They were side by side, and they used to have the old storerooms in there where you would go in and they'd wait on you, and they used to have those long holes, trigger on them. At the other end was a claw, and they could pick the groceries off the top shelf, the packages of corn flakes or whatever you ordered, and they would pack them in groceries bags for you, both of them, the A&P and the Kroger store, side by side, same business and the same service. But that was the first ones I remember in Wadsworth. Before the big supermarkets and A&P moved up on High Street with a new building, around the corner on Main Street first, then up to High Street. to the new building that now has young fellas.
When I was a youngster, I had a job on Saturday. Just come downtown with a nickel and buy the Wadsworth Banner Press, and then was to stop in the AMP and buy a copy of the Woman's Day, and that cost 2 cents.
That was something else. The newspapers, oh hey, everything was a slower life. Everything was a less expensive life in the 30s and the 40s. The next building housed a cafe, and it was called the Circus Bar Cafe. And it was a nice cafe. You'd go in there and visit. They had tables there if you wanted to play little cards. Some of the business people and some of the residents of Wadsworth would go in there and play little cards in the afternoon or in the evenings. This doorway here, been here as long as I remember, went up to the upper 2 stories of the Citizen Bank, which I believe at that time was probably one of the tallest buildings in Wadsworth. We had different elevators outside that would take you down to the basement, like over the Wright store, for their warehouse and their storage. But this is the only building that had an inside elevator that would take you up to the 3 floors and the businesses and attorneys in this office. It was the only one, and I thought that was great. An elevator like they have in Akron. I thought one in Wadsworth. I used to go in once in a while, either ride it or watch people go up and down the elevator. Now here on the side of the injector office, that is no longer the injector office, was a home on a high bank here owned by Ferrars. On the other corner here of Pine and South Main Street was a big home, dual family, and they were related to my mother. They were the Muscolinos and the Crisafullis. The Crisafulli is now Professor of Political Science, Syracuse, and his brother Sandy was Professor of Languages, Catholic University, Washington, D.C. Of course, both retired now. In the spaces across the street, there were just 2 or 3 several homes. One of them owned by Lou Geisinger, and he also owned the city service gas station that's there now is Decker Muffler, the yellow building over there. The home here on the corner here, the alleyway goes back in there, was owned by a Mr. Charlie BMI, who was a brother to Mr. Sam BMI, with Sam BMI's grocery store up in South Main Street on the square. In this space here, at one time there was an old home there. It's kind of an old log cabin type home. Later on a church was put in there. And of course, now it's a parking lot for the parking of the home on the corner here that was Dr. Lewis Zwick's last office on the corner of Chestnut and Main Street. There's an alleyway here that goes back to several homes back in the alleyway. Ferrars, Goodman's, quite a few of them had lived back in there. And on the big gray house across the street lived a fellow by the name of Ray Hoover. Of course, here on the corner, originally the first I remember here, on the corner of Chestnut and Main in this brick home here, last was Lewis Zwick. The first I remember was Quinnipiac Furniture owner, and he had a funeral home here, which was Quinnipiac Funeral Home. We used to like come over and play with the 2 girls. Carol was the oldest one that I knew the best.
Jean.
And Jean. And we used to play hide and go seek, and it was nothing to go down the basement and hide in one of the caskets. And I became used to just being able to hide in the casket, and they'd find me there. That's the first place they looked after a while. We're on the corner of Chestnut and Main Street. Across the street, in the house over there, originally the family was a Mustrick. They were a Greek family called Mustricks. Later on it became Boehners, became a florist shop. And they'd been there until they moved, I think, up onto the square, or went out of business. On the corner over here was an empty lot of a big bank as high as that building on the corner. The house behind it was originally built by Ben Yoder, who was the owner of the Chippewa Salt Company at that time, which is now, it burned down in 1928 and now is Morton Salt in Whitman, Ohio. I lived here, I believe, starting at about 2-3 years old. My room was the one with the double windows up there. This home was all brick. It was red brick. Someone painted it white since then. The roof was tile, and it was brought in from Spain. There was sheeting of copper between the tile and the roofing, woodworking in the roof. The garage had underground gas tanks underneath it, and I lived here all the way through high school. My father purchased this home, I think, for about $3,000 cash back in the lean years. And there was a big porch around it. The building here on the corner was not here at the time. The porch covered the building and the big bank down onto Main Street. The big double garage here had cupboards in the roof of the building. All the materials were the same as the house. This is a beautiful home. One time, Mr. Everhart from the salt company told me later on, Mr. Young, that they had tried to talk Mr. Yoder in building this up on the square, but he wanted down here in the south end, where we're closer to the factory down State Street and the railroad. You know, as small as this yard seems right now, at one time with a hand mower, it used to be quite a job for me to mow this lawn. Standing here was an umbrella tree, an old umbrella tree, and when I didn't behave as a small boy, my mother would tie a piece of string to the umbrella tree and onto my finger. And I could go as far as the string, and that was it for a few hours. And she would come out and check me periodically and make sure there weren't any knots tied in the string, that I didn't break it and walk away and came back and tie it. The church here originally was built as a Hungarian Baptist church. Mr. Peter Baxo, who owned a hardware and clothing store in the south end of Wadsworth, one of the earlier settlers in the south end of Wadsworth, helped build this building. And here in the corner, a bunch of us kids, my age and my brother a little older, used to hang around here on certain nights because they'd have big dinners after their services on Saturdays, on the weekends. And we would stand around here and they would always invite us in to eat with them. And it was great. The Hungarian food, and we had quite a few Hungarian people in the neighborhood here, and there was a great church, a great gentleman, Mr. Baxo, and a great Hungarian people that lived around here, and from other areas of Elyria and that would come down for the dinners, and it was great food. My uncle and aunt, Joe and Amelia LaRocca, lived in the house where they're doing a little bit of construction work, putting aluminum siding. The house, originally I remember it was asbestos siding, and there was something else. And the empty space here was a little home here, and a Mr. Bayduk lived here. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and a grandson that now is a coach of one of the high schools down near Navarre, Ohio. Great athlete, Ron Bayduk. This building was not here at the time in the 30s and the 40s. This was a steep bank as high as this building and as high as the bottom of the first story on a big brick home behind it. Now at that time, my father then built this building, a double building here out of brick. It's all stone faced now, and had a small grocery store and a barber shop. He ran the barber shop, and he had other people run the barber shop, including my brothers. Now, when they built this building, this has a full basement under the building here on the main street, and they were about a foot from the house behind it. When they went for the footer of the entire basement, the foundation of the house behind was solid stone, and it was still down deeper than the foundation for the basement of this building on the main drag here. This kept as an empty building, ended up as a better dress shop, eventually in different businesses my mother rented it out to. But the one on the corner here was always kept as a barber shop till just a few years ago. My brother Ray barbered here. My older brother Richard then barbered here. Next to the barber shop building was a Hungarian family's very good friends by the name of Lungais, Andy Lungai. Neighbors and good friends for years and years. I don't believe they ever owned a car, but behind their home here was a barn. And the barn was used for everything, storage. We used to go in there and build model airplanes with Andy. Andy then would build them real quickly. Used a lot of banana glue at that time. Stand above the top part of the barn, light them up, wind up that propeller, let her go out. I thought it was a great thing watching that airplane go down the plane. Steep bank here was a bank, same steep bank that was in front of the home where I lived on the corner of Chestnut there. Across the street, the home with the two big spires on it, that was the home of Mr. Peter Baxo. He owned the hardware and the clothing store here in the South End. He was probably one of the earlier settlers here. He was Hungarian, a great gentleman, and he did assist all people in the South End, Hungarian, Italians. He was an educated man. Whether it was self-educated or not, I don't know, but well-educated, and they would always go to Mr. Basco for information and questions. Mr. Basco, I want to tell you a little story about Mr. Basco. Mr. Basco had one arm that was cut off. Earlier, he used to be a watchman, from what I understand, on the Erie Railroad down here. And on one occasion, he saved a boy from getting hit by a train, and he had his arm taken off. And I believe at that time, from what I understand, he won the Carnegie Medal at that time, and the award from Carnegie, and this possibly may have started him in business financially, I don't know. But he was a great man, and you can tell by jumping that little boy off that train track. Heroes are not big athletes. Heroes are people that do things for other people. Mr. Basco was a hero. Here on the corner, in this home here, lived a family by the name of Weldy's. Mr. Weldy was in World War I, had quite a bit of gas. He was gassed during the war and had quite a problem medically with his stomach because of that gas. And his wife was the daughter of Mrs. Vincent, who lived around the corner and owned the big building here on the corner of Water Street and South Main Street. My childhood days, I remember being down here in the corner. This was a busy corner because of the gas station. Burbeck had the store here, had Sunday sodas, different sundries in there, and two gas pumps out here, and they were mobile gas station. This was also the stop for the Buckeye stage system. This is one of the busier corners down the south end of Wadsworth. The building here was built by a Mr. Vincent. In 1925, I believe the stone up above it says. It had an apartment upstairs, also had offices upstairs. One of the offices upstairs was one of the earliest offices I remember for Dr. Louis Zwick. The staircase is still up. You go up to the office of Dr. Louis Zwick. The Buckeye Stage System, the bus company, the earlier bus company used to stop here I used to look at the signs on the buses. They were going to Cleveland or going to Buffalo, coming out of the Rittman Road exit down here, stop here and pick up passengers and drop off passengers, and of course fuel up here at the gas pump. Mr. Burbeck and Lou Guiley was his helper here. They would come out here and pump your gas for you, pump the gas into the bus, and I used to wonder where the buses came from and where they were going to. The little storeroom here, when a car would need gasoline, Mr. Burbeck or Mr. Guiley would come out here, open the door here, get on a pair of gloves, and go out and pump the gasoline in the car. No self-service at that time, or in the bus, or in the truck, and put the oil in, back in there, take their gloves off, go in, do the cash sales, and come out and give the man his change. Across the street, the home over there belonged to, I believe, Jerkovich's. The nationality I can't remember, but fine people, and later on it became Heibergers, and later on it became Bordeners. And the building on the corner is missing now. I believe a young gentleman came down Water Street, from what I understand, I don't remember it, came down Water Street and his brakes gave out, and he went right into Bordeners, and that took out that corner of the building. The other half of the building is still there. That at that time was Jerkovich's grocery store, just a small neighborhood grocery, and it was run by the family. Family's the only people that worked there. John Jerkovich was one of the sons, and later on, after the older people passed away, he took it over with his brother Alex. Let me tell you, across the street next to Jerkovich's now is a Rainbow Grill. Now in my day, that was Weason's, and it was Weason's beer joint. Now I don't know why we called places up in the square cafes. Park Cafe, Circus Bar. Down here we called them beer joints, and that was Weason's beer joint. The Rainbow Grill, during the time it was called Weason's, Phil Nagel purchased the business and the building, but during his time a fire occurred inside and completely burned out the inside of the building. It was rebuilt, and then Phil Nagel had it, and then later on many different owners probably had it since then, but was still known as the Rainbow Grill during Phil Nagel's days, and to this day the sign says Rainbow Grill, but we knew him as a beer joint. Next to the beer joint, two-story building owned by Mr. Pete Basco. He had a hardware on the sign that says thrift shop. That was a clothing store, I'm sorry. And the other half where it says square yard flooring was a hardware store. Did a tremendous business. If you didn't find the clothes you wanted or the shoes you wanted, which were the best, him or his son Joe would pick it up, and within a few days you had the clothes you wanted. Campus, the best of shoes. The hardware is run by son John and son Alfred. Now the family worked there. The daughter, Margaret, the entire family worked in the store. Like I say, here in Wadsworth Town, most of these businesses were family owned and operated. Upstairs were apartments, and they were always rented. There was a balcony up there, and it used to be the thing for the people to come out of their apartments up there, sit on the balcony, and watch the goings on the south end of Wadsworth. Always a good business area, busy business area in the south end of Wadsworth. The building here, the big building, one story, originally was a Mr. Curtis, had some type of a store in there. That was Curtis Electric's father. Lives down here in the south end, and the home still stands there. And the store later became a Salvation Army Salvation Army then, in the last few years, moved out on College Street in a new building and in different businesses in this one-story store. Okay, next to the Salvation Army building, the parking lot now was a gully. We call it a gully. It was a deep ravine with a creek running through it that ran across to this side of the street. On the corner was a building that originally I remember as Freeman's Drugstore. Freeman's Drugstore. He was a clothing salesman that traveled the country. Mrs. Freeman ran the store for him, and periodically he'd be back in Wadsworth handling the store and the different little items they handled in the drugstore. The gully had the creek that ran all the way from up on the east side of Wadsworth past Nicodemus' storage, all the way down into the old salt company, and I believe continues on into Rittman, Ohio. The station here on the corner of Water and Main Street was a fellow by the name of Norm Boyer. Norm was a good businessman. He had a Sunoco station here for years and years, earliest I can remember. And Kenny Razor, who has Wadsworth Mower now out on Durling Drive, was one of his main mechanics earlier. Then, of course, Lou Guiley was in here, and Norm Boyer sold, I believe, eventually to Lou Guiley. Lou Guiley was the last owner that I remember back in the 40s and on into the 50s. But it was a Sunoco gas station. Behind it was a big barn, not standing anymore. We used to have auctions. The auctioneers from Wadsworth used to have different auctions, bring the merchandise in, auction it off periodically. That wasn't this gully here and this creek. We used to wade down through here with a couple of my friends, and one time back in probably the early 30s, this ravine had filled up with water, and a young boy from Wadsworth toppled into it and drowned. From then on, most of the parents of the children in Wadsworth for years tell you when you walk by here, be careful, because you know what happened here. The boy drowned. When the water gets up high, just be careful where you walk. Then they put up a fence here on the other side in the gully, on the other side where it crossed. Mr. Postak, the barber who owned this building next door, he lived in the apartment downstairs, and I ran around with his son Johnny, who retired from the Navy, I believe, as a captain. In the apartment down there with the windows, the water would get up flood stages and flood out a foot or two of their floor of their apartment. Over here, this building now is a brand new building my brother built, but back in the early years, it was a wooden building that was brought from the square of Wadsworth. It was a meat market in Wadsworth, out in the square, just next to Tubasing's, and it was moved down here, and it became Frank Giles Meat Market. He had a butcher by the name of Morris, worked for him for years and years. It was an old wooden structure, and all it was a meat market. They would bring in the beef halves, the quarters, the pork, and everything, and they would cut it up on the butcher block here and put it in the walk-in cooler. Later on, it became M&S Auto Supply. Later on, my brother Ray bought this for a barber shop, tore it down, built a new structure, and this is where he retired as a barber in the south end of Wadsworth. And now it still becomes a barber shop. I believe he sold it to the gentleman that owns it now, Wayne's Barber Shop. Oh, looky here. Lucky. There's a penny I found. I'll put it in my shoe eventually, and I think it'll bring me luck. Here in this space, on this side of the steps that go down into the Postak apartment, was a little wooden structure, and it was owned by Joe Dudas. Earlier, there were other barbers, including possibly my father may have barbered in there. The building's now gone. Mr. Dudas is gone, and it's just an empty space here into the gully now. The steps here Going down to underneath Postack Barber Shop was the apartments where Mr. and Mrs. Postack lived with their daughter Irene and son John. John was in my class in high school and Homer Baldwin's class. And like I say, at times when the floods would come, a foot or so of the basement would be covered with water. This little building here at one time was Postack's Barber Shop. This had a cover over the top, the entire building did, 2 buildings here. Mr. Postack had a barber shop here, and in the rear of the barber shop was a little room where they had some billiard tables. And quite a few of the young fellows would hang down here and play billiards in the back of Mr. Postack's barber shop. Mr. Postack had been here for years, done a great job barbering here, years and years. This storeroom here, what I remembered in the 30s and 40s, was Fenton's grocery store. Again, a family-owned and operated grocery store. The son was well known around town later on, worked for Betsy Ross' company, was Keg Fenton. Keg Fenton was the son. This was, like I say, a grocery store. Next to the grocery store was a small wooden structure, an alleyway now. Small wooden structure, but it did have an alleyway beside it. And this was a shoe repair store that I first remember by an Italian fellow by the name of Mr. Restivo. Let me tell you a story about Mr. Restivo. Back in about the late 30s, early 40s, late 30s, I'd say, he went back to Italy to visit his sister. And my brother Richard and I were taking him to the Akron train station to catch the train to go to New York and catch a ship. And on the way there and back around the area of Brookside Country Club, we turned and came back 3 or 4 times. He decided not to go, then decided to go, and about at Western Star we'd turn around again. We did it 2 or 3 times, and the last time he decided to go on to Italy to visit his relatives. Well, as history made it, Mr. Restivo in Italy was poisoned for some reason or by some unknown persons, and persons that I know in the hometown where my father and Mr. Restivo were born. The thing was never solved on who poisoned him and why he was poisoned. The storeroom here was a grocery store owned by the DePleta family, Mr. Sam DePleta. He owned a grocery store, and again it was family-owned, family-run by Charlie, and later on, you all know Tony DePleta had Taylor's Market. And 2 sisters and Joe ran this store, and it was just a local grocery store, had Italian food, and of course, groceries of all kinds. The building on the corner here was Echo Grill, owned by Charles Eckhoff. He lived across the street in the lot. And this was built by Renner Brewer Company back in the, no doubt, the 30s. It became a bar here, a good eating place. Mr. Eckhoff ran it for years and years and ran a good, clean establishment, good, clean food. Mrs. Postack was the cook here. She was Hungarian, Mr. John Postack's wife, and she knew how to cook. They would come from all over, the match shop, the business around here, and have their lunch, and on Friday night the fish dinners here. And of course they had live music on Sunday night, and we would stand there as kids and watch this window. It's a glass block now. At that time it was a window pane, and the band would sit there, and we thought that was the greatest entertainment. And it was the only entertainment we ever knew the south end of Wadsworth, outside of the movies across the street later on. But this was the entertainment. It was a nice bar.